I'm going to introduce Dr. Nikki Robinson, ICIT Fellow and Professor at Capital Tech University, who will introduce the panelists for Safer Modernizing Critical Infrastructure. Please help me welcoming Dr. Robinson.
Hi. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. So today, I'm really excited to moderate this panel. We're going to be doing Safer Modernizing Critical Infrastructure. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. Let's go ahead and start with Cordell Schachter, CIO of the Department of Transportation. All right, next up we have Daryl Hagley. He's an ICIT Fellow as well as a Technical Director at the Department of the Air Force. I think everybody knows Daryl, yeah. Next up, we have Michael Palmer, Associate CIO and CXO for the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce. All right, and we also have Dr. David Mussington, Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at CISA. All right, so welcome panel. We're gonna be discussing lots of topics today, but let's start out really light. You know, we'll start with a really light topic. And this is for really everyone on the panel. How do you balance speed to delivery with cybersecurity? Do you wanna start, Dr. Mussington?
Well, of course, I'm from the federal government, so speed of delivery is often not the highest. I think it's important to balance expectations of speed as well as with speed of delivery, because expectations of speed that don't take into account critical infrastructure risk or security values are just that, expectations that involve the acceptance of risk inadvertently. So I'd sort of ask people to think more clearly about what they expect in terms of supportable speed that doesn't expose their enterprises to maximal risk.
Yeah, no, I mean, I run a development shop, so we like speed, but like you mentioned, I think it comes down to the balance of risks that you're willing to take. And it makes me think of the executive champions above me that support that thoughtful risk management that our shop takes. Again, we have three pillars to our shop. We have the development shop, we have the ops shop, and then we have this security shop, and that DevSecOps unified team going together manages risks collaboratively. And I think that doesn't happen in a lot of shops. To have that communication amongst the team members throughout the entire product development lifecycle with the goal of speed as well as, you know, protecting the things that we need to protect.
I've been excited over the last 10 years to see the speed and innovation that a lot of the industry has been able to provide. But I know that for those of you who pay taxes, can we see a show of hands? No. So, but the money that we're charged to spend is your money. So I don't think anybody wants us to just spend on the latest and greatest thing. They want us to take some time, review. But what we owe you is a fair place to have these things reviewed on networks in real environments. And so that's where I'm hoping to see getting a little bit more speed in that area.
Well, it's a great question, and it really encapsulates two of the priorities that the White House has charged DOT Secretary Pete Buttigieg with, and that's, number one, getting the money out quickly and letting the American people see that the American government is investing in their communities and improving infrastructure after a long time where the federal government has not help communities improve their infrastructure and also improve things, not only cybersecurity, but equity and raising communities and particularly reaching non-traditional grantees in territories and tribes, local operators that haven't ever received a federal grant before. And when we present them with the White House's priority on making critical infrastructure and all infrastructure secure by design against all hazards, not just cybersecurity, We know we have folks that have never had a practice in resiliency, in cybersecurity, so that we have to use our engagement with them and hopefully with all of you as well to reach these operators in states and local governments to develop the capacity to improve their cybersecurity, and they're not going to get all the way there in the first round. And that's not the expectation, but are they moving forward to eventually reach that holy grail where they have a cybersecurity practice, they have a cybersecurity point of contact, someone who at least will take responsibility for their cybersecurity improvements?
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned, you brought up resiliency, right? And that's part of that sort of modernization, right, is talking about resiliency. So can you talk a little bit about some of the innovation when it comes to the resiliency space, or maybe where we need some of that? I don't know, Daryl, if you want to start with the resiliency topic.
Well, I'd certainly like to see some innovation there. I'd like to see some of our leaders really try and embrace practicing this ahead of time. I've heard, unfortunately, a number of DoD leaders saying, well, can't we just go back to just analog days and disconnecting all these from the network? And just really, I want to ask them, when are they retiring? Because that's not helpful. That's not where everybody's going. It's where, we need innovation. And I appreciate, resilience. We should be able to practice if we do go down, if we are exploited, how do we bring this back up? U.S. Cyber Command several years ago built together these tactics and procedures, and they had OT specialists and IT specialists, and they had them come together and work through what would happen to try and defend an OT network. And so we built these unclassified tactics, techniques, procedures to focus on resilience, to expect that you'll be breached. What do you do next? I think what we need to do now is go through those motions to figure out how what places we need to invest in that may not be technology or may not be people, but part of that whole resiliency process.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments on resiliency or innovation?
Just to comment that we need predictable resilience, which I know may seem like an oxymoron. I think that, we need performance goals to make sure that whatever we're trying to do is bracketed against real risk remediation. It's not as if there aren't an infinity of TTPs that we can track. We need a way to prioritize those and make some decisions that allow us to program finite dollars. And I'm sort of reminded by Cordell that getting the security equity represented in capital decision-making can often be difficult. And that means having a resilience metric that you can pursue. And the closer we can get to replicable metrics in critical infrastructure context, the better off we'll be.
And if I can add to that, so those cybersecurity performance goals are something that we've heard from industry, that they want the government to be less proscriptive because there is so much technology, legacy IT, legacy OT, that to David's point, we couldn't have a TTP for everything out there. Instead, we need to lead them and have a consistent message for the US government's expectations, and then let the owners of that technology meet those expectations within some reasonable period of time.
And if I may, I'd applaud DHS in actually in publishing and working with industry to come up with those performance goals. And I guess they provided just an update about a month ago. And now I'm hoping that, industry holds the government accountable for using and measuring those. Because I would really love to see senior leadership in the Department of Defense ask us how well we're doing in implementing those goals, and other departments as well. So, and the great part about that was those were co-developed with yourselves.
Yeah, excellent. So to switch topics a little bit and to get more into IT/OT, and there's been a lot of talk about IT/OT convergence, right? Where do IT and OT sort of come together? So do you keep them as separate systems? Do you bring them together? How are you sort of managing this IT/OT convergence area that we're in now?
Oh, me first, okay. First of all, I work in the infrastructure security division, so I will quickly defer to Cordell on this topic. More seriously, I think that, IT-OT convergence is the way we talk about it. We don't think we have parallel systems. We have convergent systems that have control fabrics that are integrated well with each other. That means that IT risks impose burden on OT systems and vice versa, even though the risk mitigation guidance may diverge. So don't just take simple controls fabrics and apply them to OT systems and expect them to have predictable outcomes and vice versa. I think that what it means is that, 15 years ago when I used to work at Amtrak, the OT side of the house wouldn't talk to the IT side of the house in terms of security because they used to say that we weren't real engineers, quote. We weren't. But that sort of thing can't continue. So you now see converged governance as well for OT and IT risk. And I think that's the way we think you're going to maximize real progress.
Yeah, and what we've seen where the OT has become IT, there isn't much of an argument that the IT controls apply now to that converged OT. There is still an argument on the OT side. We don't, from our office of the CIO, as our expertise is in IT, so we're not going to pretend to be experts in any particular OT, but when we engage with systems, grantees or DOT-zone systems, other operators, we do insist that they do apply some control set to them and do it according to the way, if it's, say, a NIST control set, the way that NIST intended it.
Absolutely. Yeah, go.
So I love that term convergence, and it's great if you've got that kind of maturity in some, but we're still working, I see in a lot of places, of just OT recognition, that there is a network that is disconnected from the main network and that still needs some level of protection. As many folks, if you've been following a lot of what ICIT's been talking about, these networks, even though they're standalone, a vendor comes and does an update to them, and if you don't have a good policy and process and verification, then there's an opportunity for something to happen on that network. And if you don't have anything to recognize that kind of presence, then you don't know the adversaries on that network. And we continue to see that's the goal of nation-state adversaries, is to be in a position to take the next step, not necessarily show their hand that they have the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're talking about these different types of IT, OT systems, how do you partner with different stakeholders, and how do you account for differing levels of cybersecurity maturity? Everyone's at a different place in where their cyber programs are. How do you sort of account for that when you're working with stakeholders and partners?
I'll take that first. I think that you can account for it because people are on a journey. If you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, for example, you're likely to be in one place, whether you're OT or IT focused. The longer-term programmatics or long-term programs where people have thought seriously and made deliberate decisions about risk management tend to be more mature and tend to be more able to, hopefully, adopt cutting-edge risk insights, even if they don't adopt the most recent or most experimental technologies to remediate. So planning is where we think that the real differentiator is.
Great.
I'll say prior to the bipartisan infrastructure laws signing, we saw it coming because we're familiar with our operators that there is, a lot of disparity in terms of cybersecurity maturity. And it could be a transit system that is only a couple of buses or vans compared to the transit system, say, of Los Angeles or Chicago, which is multimodal and has, in Chicago's case, a lot of legacy technology merged with current technology. And we realized that our message to them to improve cybersecurity and to either modernize and build back better in the area of cybersecurity would involve an approach that could kind of love everyone and engage everyone, which is why instead of getting too creative or too innovative, we adopted existing TSA guidelines and directives. I mentioned one before, identifying a cybersecurity point of contact, That should take anybody an hour, tops, even if it's not their job now, but who's going to get trained and who takes responsibility for it. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've asked them to do a self-assessment, similar kind of self-assessment that TSA's asked them to do about their practice. And we're giving them time to do it, hopefully with a technical partner who could help them complete it honestly, so that they see where their weaknesses are and can use the results of that self-assessment to make informed decisions, risk-managed decisions, risk-informed decisions about where they need to make future investments.
And I think one of the best phrases is kind of show me the money in this space, right? So we've been asked several times by Congress on show us where you stand in assessing your defense critical infrastructure. And then most recently in 2022, NDAA 1505 said show us how well you're mapping your most critical assets and show us that you're investing in the operational technology that is protecting those assets. So, I implore those folks who want to get more insight on how well the department's doing there is to ask the right folks to try and follow up and get those answers. Because that still is a complete imbalance on where the focus has been. And then one other thing I'd like to add is I know many government programs have instituted requirements for the sector to implement. So, for example, the EPA for the water, go do certain requirements there, or Department of Energy, here are the security requirements for utilities. But there still are a lot of government entities that have yet to employ control systems requirements even on their own assets, right? So I encourage us to look at not only what we're asking others to do, but what we should be doing on our own federal assets.
Yeah, great. Well, that leads perfectly into my next question. Thank you for that. Because I'm curious, as someone who's in the private sector and consumes a lot of great content by CISA and some of the other agencies, how well do you think that agencies are sort of working together and sharing information and coming together? And I think this is a great panel for that too. Michael, can we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for the Bureau of Industry and Security, not Department of Commerce as a whole, but we are a customer of what CISA puts out in terms of creating a customer experience from a cyber consumer and the regulations that are pulled down upon us. It's better than it's been in the past. I used to work at CISA, so I know a little bit about how things are going, but I'd have to pass it off to Dr. Mussing to just teeing it up softball over there. Things are going better from a customer experience standpoint in terms of being a consumer of the what's being pushed down from a CISA perspective.
So I have to, of course, quote our director, that as America's Cyber Defense Agency, our focus this year and going forward, we want to be collaborative, but we want to also raise the baseline that all federal agencies operate under. So from making our services available to agency colleagues to binding operational directives to ensure consistency when specific problems and vulnerabilities show up, we're out to raise the level of ambient performance across federal agencies. We're also doing things like making sure that we can get information on the standing of specific agencies relative to risk clusters and threats and vulnerabilities that we become aware of. So a real emphasis on information exchange between CISA as national coordinator and CISA as leader of the Federal Senior Leadership Council and the response for the Federal Civilian and Executive Branch agencies. Note, Federal Civilian Executive Branch. Not the intelligence community, not our defense colleagues either. So we have our ambitions and our authorities front of mind. The Congress has also been very generous in giving us more authorities and significantly new resources to pursue those ends. The last thing I'd say is that the performance goals were designed with that in mind. They extend beyond the federal family, but we think getting our own house in order first is the most important near-term thing that we have control over.
Great. Daryl, no?
So, I applaud CISA for continuing to provide a lot of information and alerts and things that we all should be tracking for those systems in our infrastructure. I remember NSA and DHS had put out hey, here are the top like 18 systems that China's going after. And it was an unclassified notification. So I turned that around to the civil engineers and I said, do we have any of these systems? And have we done all the patching and all this? And it was quite refreshing that there were 4 that we had known about and that we had notified all the right folks and we were going to be tracking those. So I was glad to see that part of the process work. One of the things I know that we can do better on, and I'd really like to see us being held accountable, is how much information and and the quality of that information going back to CISA from all of us, right? So all the government entities, and the defense industrial base, no one likes a report card, but how well are we doing? Are you getting the things you'd like? What more can we give you? I know there are some forums in which that is discussed. I think we could share more.
I mean, the concept of customer experience doesn't lend itself naturally to a cybersecurity shop, right? I mean,
Right.
It just hasn't in the past. So I challenge this community here, when you go back to your customers, if you're a contractor, if you're a Fed, when you go back to your shops, think about how are you impacting the folks that consume the services that you create and put out there. That level of empathy, which is seeping itself into CISA, as you're hearing, is what's going to make a difference in terms of improving the rising the level of all agencies. So, yeah.
Just on that last point, obviously CISA is well concerned with customer experience and the accessibility of what we produce in terms of both risk mitigation guidance and practical support if incidents occur. So reach out, tell us how we're doing. We have obviously protective security advisors in 10 regions. We have hundreds of cybersecurity specialists of various types, from vulnerability management to our most recent innovation, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, which is a sort of a tactical operational risk manager that's useful for both proactive presence before breaches and ransomware occur, but also for characterizing the risk history that we all live relative to malware and denials of service. So that engagement, that relationship, and its quality is a front of mind concern for us.
If you have a CX story to tell in the cybersecurity world, it's unique. So I'd love to hear about it as well, I'm sure a couple other people in here. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, to sort of take it to, from agency to agency, but how are agencies and the private sector, how is that flow of information coming back and forth too? Because that's an important area for, private sector to share information and back and forth to make sure that, everybody's sort of, one, getting the information that they need, but understanding really what's going on in the environment. So can you speak a little bit to maybe some of those private sector partnerships or how you think some of those things are going, especially when we're talking about critical infrastructure?
So, I think in the first instance, you have the sort of SCC's GCC relationship where sectors speak to DHS and to their sector risk management agencies. For example, for transportation, it's not us, it's the Department of Transportation. For energy, it's DOE, et cetera. There are 16 critical infrastructure sectors which we engage in. We're the SRMA for 8 of those, commercial facilities, nuclear, et cetera. I think that that's the principal environment or ecosystem through which information exchange on risk status takes place. There's something called the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council system, set up a very long time ago when DHS was first set up, that sets up safe harbors for information exchange and potentially protection for asset vulnerability and criticality information that's shared with us. So in that context, you can have a sensitive but unclassified conversation with us and with our SRMA colleagues. And if necessary, we can provide venues for a higher level. But that's the most institutionalized information exchange on critical infrastructure risk that I'm aware of. Prior to this job, I had one set of opinions about how well that was working. Now, of course, I would say it's swimmingly wonderful. The point is we can always learn about how to speak better to industry in language that they understand, not just sort of Fed speak, which can be fairly opaque to people who don't work or aren't familiar with the federal government. So that's the DHS-driven information exchange platform. There are others colleagues can probably talk about.
So at DOT, and particularly in trying to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which basically allocates almost $1 trillion for local transportation projects, the federal policy needs to get implemented at the local level. And if you don't have the capacity to do that, you don't have the technical assistance to do that, it's not going to get done. It'll look good as federal policy, but that information exchange, including through the vendor community, but the local government communities, in states, tribal, territorial governments, that's where either we're going to make things better, we're going to build it back better, or we're not. And when we task them with overall goals like building or modernizing infrastructure secure by design, a lot of the cases, they're not sure what that means. So government itself needs to get better about being solution-oriented, less product-oriented. The bipartisan infrastructure law didn't exist 2 years ago. So it's a new challenge for the government. As I mentioned earlier, the president wants the money out, wants communities to see the benefit of this investment, but sometimes, things that you're duly diligent on to make sure money's not wasted, because no one has a tolerance for wasted money, takes a while, where things that are fast can sometimes be not fully vetted. So we have to arrive at kind of the Goldilocks solution in terms of velocity, while not losing track of the goals, not just to build back better, but to figure out what that better means in terms of all hazards resilience and in particular cybersecurity.
Great.
Yeah, and for the DoD, we've been communicating back and forth with the Defense Industrial Base. We created the Defense Cybercrime Center, and that is a place where if you join and can get information from there, you can get information back and forth. And as you mentioned years ago, we in the government knew that adversaries were attacking all these systems, and recognizing that some in industry either weren't aware of it, didn't have the systems or the insight to secure them, and so a lot of those have since improved. And I totally understand, everyone would like to know as soon as the intelligence community recognizes something getting exploited, but there's also dual uses for that, right? So not everything can be shared as immediately as people would like, but being a part of those forums can get you out in front.
Excellent. So when you're talking about, essentially there are a ton of different policies, we're talking about regulations, there's the executive order that came out, there's a lot of information that's coming out around cybersecurity, best practices, how we should really, what we should prioritize and how to do it. So who do you think is really setting those priorities, and where can we sort of focus on cybersecurity guidance?
I think there's a number of places where priorities are set, so can refocus your question a little bit.
Sure.
I can give you
Yeah, so-
our answer.
Is this a trick question?
Yes.
Yes, trick question. Yes, totally. No.
Spidey sense. Cut off.
There's a lot of great information that comes out from both the federal side, right, and there's a lot of private sector information that comes out too. But where do you sort of focus your cybersecurity priorities when it comes to modernizing critical infrastructure?
Well, so again, covering two different things. So the executive order applies to federal agencies, federal civilian agencies. So it has not been nationalized and doesn't necessarily apply to all the operators. It's all good advice, and they should be doing that, but we don't have the authority to compel it. In grant making, for discretionary grants, which means that the grantee is competing with other potential grantees for that money, we can insert certain conditions, and we are around cybersecurity. We think they're eminently reasonable conditions. There's those TSA guidelines and directives that I previously mentioned. And so they're achievable and don't necessarily require a high degree of technical cybersecurity expertise. But those operators still need to be responsible for their existing and new information technology, as the operational technology that is information technology, as well as the operational technology that we discussed before, that the government can issue either risk management frameworks or performance goals on, but it is really up to the operator to implement that fully. So this is another case that exists throughout the US economy, where the government has certain authorities to set standards, regulate, put rules out there, but it's really the private sector that has to deliver it.
And regularly, every couple of years, we put together a national strategy, national security strategy, and Department of Defense updates their DoD cyber strategy. But I think one of the most effective governing requirements that came out was the National Security Manager had published last fall. Now, it used to be that if you had a system that supported the intelligence community, it could rise to the level of a national security system. Well, they updated this to where if you have infrastructure on your base, if you have control systems or OT that support a critical asset for a mission, it now rises to the level of a national security system, which comes with a whole bunch of gifts and money and no, none of that. Probably, some oversight, some questions, and making sure that you have things in place, but also some technical support as well. So I think that's one of the latest that can help us elevate where we stand with defense critical infrastructure.
Great.
Well, if I can mention something about overall risk prioritization and the way we sort of are seeing things, we think more about threat self-consciously than we have maybe in the past. So we identify particular actors, and anybody from sitting here would say this, that we're interested in nation-state threats to critical infrastructure viability. And the countries of concern are, well, there's a lot of countries of concern. The top concerns are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And that's not a secret. And the capabilities those countries can potentially leverage against our critical infrastructures, all of them, government and non-government, are concerning, and that is the pacing requirement for our risk mitigation. It's not as if it's static. Those capabilities are advancing, and there are offensive advantages in this environment. So that's the pacing adversary that we're trying to get traction against.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're getting close on time. I didn't actually bring my watch.
That never
Watch says
started.
35.
That's right.
Thank you. I couldn't see from the
Back to
podium.
the
Thank you.
future.
So I think that about wraps us up then on our time, right? So 35?
No, it never started.
Oh, well,
Shows how
do you
much
have the time?
When are we supposed to end? People who are tracking at
1:25.
home?
What time is it? We have 2 minutes. Great,
minutes.
fantastic.
Wrap it up.
Perfect.
Now it starts to move.
Wow.
So anyway, so it sounds like we have 2 minutes to wrap up, which is perfect. So everybody gets 30 seconds, yeah. So to sort of wrap up, right, we talked about cyber resiliency, modernizing infrastructure. So do you have any final thoughts on sort of anything we need to be focused on, anything we need to think about moving forward with IT, OT, and modernizing critical infrastructure?
I'll be quick and just say that, public-private partnerships and collaboration is what makes this work. And exemplifying that in everything we do in terms of risk management, not punitive, collaborative, is what we found most successful to date.
Great.
Good people are at the heart of what we're doing, so it's hard to find good people. And I need creative people to do the things that we're trying to do, and energetic people that have a passion for the mission. And so as you're going out talking to all types of people to bring in to take care of this, I think those are the kinds of things that I look for.
Great.
I used to struggle with the concept of destiny or fate until last night. I'm thinking about what I'm going to wear, and I look at I see in the closet a tie that I bought, 3 years ago, and then also in my dresser, socks that I bought 6 months ago. So they just happened to come together. I did not, there was no pre-planning. So I'm in now. So just two things. To understand what's connected and who has access really to every system, even if it's not on the main network, we really need to understand that.
Perfect.
Boy, that's a tough act to follow. But it's probably worth mentioning the obvious, that we talk about lots of different efforts needing a village to complete. This one needs a nation. And what we do with domestic regular infrastructure, critical infrastructure, becomes a national security issue. So the smallest things we used to take for granted, we can't take for granted anymore. And the threats that are prevented by good, just basic cyber hygiene, as well as the advanced threats that will need advanced tools, will take the attention and investment of the entire nation to keep us safe. Try to go to bed tonight thinking about your socks and ties. That's it.
That was perfect. Thank you so much. Big round of applause to our panel. Thank you all so much.